Doncs benvingudes i benvinguts a la Biblioteca Jaume Fuster. Welcome to the library. Paul, gràcies, Anna, per fer aquesta conducció. Per nosaltres és un plaer cloure aquest díptic neozelandès a les biblioteques de Barcelona, presentant el darrer llibre editat per Impedimenta del Paul Olin. És una col·laboració feta amb l'ambaixada, feta amb Casa Àsia i té com a objectiu últim fer conèixer altres literatures que no siguin les del mainstream i creiem que era aquest d'octubre era una data indispensable perquè poguéssim agendar aquest díptic neozelandès. Vam començar amb la Eleanor Catton i ara tanquem amb el Paul. No m'extenc gaire, ja us deia, en nom de Biblioteques de Barcelona i en nom de la Biblioteca Jaume Fuster, que està especialitzada en viatges, és un plaer tenir-vos aquí. I cedeixo la paraula al representant de Casa Àsia, Javier.
Muchas gracias, muy buena tarde, muy buenas tardes. Mi nombre es Javier Parrondo, dirijo Casa Àsia. Hoy vamos a estar en familia, es un martes. Nueva Zelanda a veces es un país lejano y poco conocido, pero nuestra labor, siempre lo decimos, es acercar el continente asiático y el Pacífico a España, a Cataluña, a Barcelona, y en ese empeño, aprovechando esta 37 edición de la Copa América, el Ayuntamiento de Barcelona, como saben, ha lanzado lo que se denomina la regata cultural. Y en ese marco se han desarrollado una serie de actividades en torno al mundo de la náutica y en torno, no lo olvidemos, al país organizador de esta edición de Copa América, que es Nueva Zelanda. Nueva Zelanda ganó la pasada edición y el ganador es el que determina las condiciones de la siguiente edición que se está celebrando estos días en Barcelona. Hoy tenemos la gran suerte de contar con un destacado representante de la literatura neozelandesa, Paul Ewen. Thank you so much for coming. Gracias por estar aquí, que tendrá una conversación con la periodista Anna Ballbona, que también nos acompañó la pasada semana con otra conversación que tuvimos de este estilo. Así que gracias por acompañarnos hoy. La idea es crear una ventana hacia Nueva Zelanda, acercar en este caso su literatura y que conozcan, bueno, en este caso una obra como es la de Francis Plack, cómo ser un autor público, que a través de una serie de eventos reales del autor, bueno, pues genera caos, confusión y en definitiva nos da a entender, nos abre una puerta a lo que significa ser autor y ser un ser humano en el siglo XXI. Así que espero que esta conversación sea provechosa para todos y no pierdan de vista la página web de Casa Àsia, porque hemos puesto a disposición del público barcelonés toda una serie de actividades en torno a Nueva Zelanda, y aquí me gustaría destacar el ciclo de cine neozelandés que se está desarrollando en los cines Girona y que podrán ver. Pues todavía quedan algunas películas, pero ya se ha proyectado El piano, por ejemplo, en fin, filmografía neozelandesa que yo creo que será de su gusto. Muchísimas gracias y de paso la palabra a la embajadora de Nueva Zelanda, que también tenemos el honor de contar hoy con su presencia, Tara Morton. Tara, thank you so much.
Ena mana ena reo e raurangatira mā, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Dear colleagues, authorities and friends, I wanted to greet you in the language of New Zealand, Te Reo Māori. It's a real pleasure to be here again at the fantastic Biblioteca Jaume Fuster to open the second event of the Encounter with New Zealand Writers series that's been organised by Casa Àsia and Biblioteca Barcelona. And I wanted to thank again our friends at Casa Àsia and Biblioteca Barcelona for bringing New Zealand authors closer to the Spanish public. This is a fantastic opportunity for growing people-to-people links between our two countries, and so we're really pleased to be here tonight. And I'm also really honoured to introduce to you Paul Ewen, the author of the award-winning Francis Plack series. This evening we'll be chatting with Paul about his most well-known novel, Francis Plack, How to Be a Public Author. It's a highly stimulating and daring satire on the book industry, awards and the recognition of writers. The book was translated into Spanish and published last year by Impedimenta Editorial, so that makes it really accessible to the Spanish public. In 2018, the second book of the series was published, Francis Plug, Writer-in-Residence, where we continue to unravel the ups and downs of this shameless character. I'm sure we'll have a wonderful evening talking with Paul, so without wanting to take up any more of our author's speaking time, I wanted to conclude with a Māori proverb known as a whakatoki. Ko te kata kata te rongo a pā rawa itu. Laughter is the best medicine. Thank you very much. Muchas gracias.
Molt bé, bona tarda. Bona tarda a Paul Ewen, Francis Plug. Ho han comentat ara en les presentacions. Avui parlarem d'aquest llibre Francis Plug, Cómo ser un autor público, que és el llibre que inaugura aquesta saga, podríem dir, dedicada a un personatge entranyable i a un univers, no sé si tan entranyable, que és l'univers de la indústria editorial, l'univers literari, però en tot cas un univers que Paul Ewen utilitza per estripar, per fer-nos riure, per també, crec jo, fer-hi escolar moltes veritats de certs funcionaments del sector, diguem-ne. Jo no m'estendré més amb les presentacions perquè t'han presentat molt bé, Paul. Comentar sí que abans d'aquesta saga hi ha una primera novel·la, London Pub Reviews, que ja va ser descrita com un encreuament entre Blade Runner i Coronation Street i com una obra dotada de gran enginy còmic. Clar, jo quan em plantejava com presentar, com enfocar aquesta conversa, en tot moment em venia al meu costat un Francis Plug que em sabotejava l'acte. I per tant espero que no hi hagi cap convidat infiltrat disposat a fer-nos la guitza. Però en tot cas sí que penso que no deixa de tenir molta gràcia fer un acte públic al voltant d'un llibre còmic que se suposa que explica com ser un autor públic i a més això, té gràcia i fa que qui comença a preguntar a l'escriptor públic doncs primer de tot li hagi de preguntar si aquesta novel·la i sobretot això, el personatge Francis Plug ha estat una font infinita de divertiments durant l'escriptura i després, sobretot.
Thank you, and thank you very much for the welcomes earlier. It has been a very enjoyable process to write this book and the second book, and I'm actually writing the third and final book in the series at the moment. So I started writing the book when I first arrived in London, and I realised that you could go to these events with these amazing authors and actually hear them and then meet them afterwards. So I started doing that out of interest for just the authors that I had an opportunity to see. And then I started taking notes, and those notes took on a life of their own and developed into fictional pieces. And I built this character based around someone who attends lots of these events. So Francis has been introduced tonight. He's a bit of a wayward character, but there is a bit of crossover with myself, not in the extreme sense, but I was writing, I had written a book of short stories, but I was worried about what it would be like to be on stage as an author, because these days as an author there's a lot of PR and marketing, and it's not just about sitting in a room and writing. You need to have skills to talk to the public and be on stage. And so I thought that was quite an interesting thing for this character to be thinking about. And so the reason it's called How to Be a Public Author is he's learning what all these, in this case, Booker Prize winning authors, how they perform and talk on stage. Besides just writing their books, they're actually getting up there and facing the public. So that was the start of it. And since then, so the interesting part, I guess, was I would go to these events in character, I guess, as Francis, and after the events, I would ask the author to sign the books to Francis Plug. So each chapter in the book starts with that author's actual signature to Francis Plug. And we were talking earlier, but initially a lot of people thought, well, they're not real, but I actually have now over 200 books in real life signed to Francis Plug from an amazing array of people. So because that is part of my writing, I guess, program for these books, it is unusual and definitely keeps me amused and entertained doing that, even now still.
Clar, ara pensava que jo ja estic veient un futur museu Francis Plug amb la col·lecció de firmes i tot de gadgets, gadgets i tot també de les diferents tipus d'alcohol que veu Francis Plug. No sé si tu quan deies que anaves caracteritzat de Francis Plug, no sé si això era incorporar els litres d'alcohol. Suposo que no, perquè se't veu bé, se't veu ben conservat.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question because when I first started going to these author events, there was a regular series that was run by the Guardian newspaper, and so as part of your ticket you would get some complimentary wine was included in the ticket price, and so I saw that as an opportunity to Francis to have more wine than other people, basically. But since the first book or the second book, people have told me, and I've noticed myself, that there's a lot less free wine now on offer for the author events in London. So it's possible that they don't want anyone to sort of emulate his style. But for myself, I didn't go too crazy.
Clar, i alhora, bé, com veieu i estem explicant, no? Francis Plug és algú obsessionat amb escriptors contemporanis i amb la idea de la imatge pública de l'escriptor. Això fa que, de l'escriptor i guanyador del Booker Prize, això fa que pel llibre, i amb aquestes dedicatòries reals, és a dir, quan comences a llegir el llibre dius és impossible que sigui real, doncs sí, ho són. Clar, el llibre s'acaba convertint en una desfilada de grans escriptors anglosaxons contemporanis, Margaret Atwood, Salman Rushdie, Julian Barnes, Coetzee, Hilary Mantel. En certa manera, també es pot llegir el llibre com una invitació a llegir aquests autors. És a dir, és un exercici de literatura comparada singular, però que també se'l pot entendre així, no?
Yes, very much, I think. I mean, I read all the books as I was going to the events, and actually there's parts that Francis picks up on in his oddness. So when part of the books that he has conversations with the authors at the after the events, and he often references parts from their books that he's read, and often misinterprets them. But yes, it very much is like, I think that was quite an important part of actually referencing the books themselves. So, and it's not just a genre of a specific author. In the first book, it is specifically on Booker Prize winning books. So those books, in particular, he gets into them and references them, whether it's, Midnight's Children, from, Salman Rushdie to, something by Margaret Atwood, or even Eleanor Catton as in the final chapter. So yeah, I think it is. Hopefully, you can actually learn something good about those books as well as you go through them all.
I clar, també veient totes les situacions absurdes, estripades, de vegades gairebé maleducades de Francis Plack amb aquests escriptors, inevitablement ve la pregunta de si tots els escriptors que hi apareixen s'han pres amb un gest olímpic, és a dir, s'han pres bé a convertir-se en personatges de ficció, personatges literaris. Vull dir que el joc, en broma, és un joc molt divertit i d'enginyeria literària també. No sé si tothom s'ho ha pres bé.
Well, it's a good question too. One thing my publisher did as soon as the book was published in London was they sent a copy to every author in the book, and I don't know if everyone got their copy through their publisher or if they all read them, but I only had 2 bits of feedback from the actual authors, and they were both positive, luckily. The first was actually Margaret Atwood, who sent a note saying that she loved it and she loved the concept, and I think she was going to try and avoid Francis in the future. And similarly, Hilary Mantel, who is the only English novelist to win the Booker Prize twice. So we sent that copy off to her, and then she actually sent a blurb for the follow-up books without being asked. So she wrote a very funny blurb saying that Francis deserved to be on the 4th plinth. In London, the 4th plinth is in Trafalgar Square, and it's an empty plinth, and they use it for. It's now used as a contemporary art site. So I think it's 18 months, they put a new piece of contemporary art on top of it. So Hilary Mantel said, Francis deserves to be on the 4th plinth. Perhaps he should be chained to it. So that was the only feedback. So if I think most of the authors hopefully have taken it in good humour. It was never intended to be a criticism of the authors itself. It was more about the process, the whole publishing, the publicity, and the publicity machine that authors have to go through these days.
D'això en parlarem, perquè sí que et volia preguntar, no?, sobre aquesta visió al capdavall del màrqueting, que en principi poc té a veure amb a priori diríem que poc té a veure amb la literatura, però abans Donat que fa uns dies vam tenir aquí a la Linnea Keaton i que ella apareix, és una de les autores que apareix al final del llibre, va reaccionar bé la Linnea Keaton? Ho dic perquè estem en família neozelandesa, no passa res, queda aquí. I qui ho vegi pel YouTube, però ja està.
I don't know actually what Eleanor's reaction was. The day before she won the Booker Prize, I went to it was an event in London, and it had all the shortlisted authors for the Booker Prize that year, and I had a premonition that she would win. So I only asked her to sign a book to Frances Plug, and I was so lucky that she did. But I was so glad, obviously, because she's a New Zealander. But Eleanor was living in New Zealand and I was living in London, and now she's moved actually to Cambridge, I think just outside London, but we haven't met since, so I still need to ask her. But there is another New Zealander in this book who is another New Zealand Booker Prize winner, who is Kerry Hume. And what's interesting about that chapter is it's the only one, I'll see if I can find it quickly. It's the only one that's not signed to Frances Plug, and that is because she never enjoyed the public side of being an author, and she wasn't interested in going and doing signings or going around the festivals. And in a way, Francis sees her as his favourite author because that's the sort of life he wants to lead. He's so concerned about having to do the public side of being an author, and he sees her as someone who just stays true to who she is and focuses on the writing and isn't pressured into doing the public side of it, the publicity.
Clar, no sé si des que vas publicar la novel·la en anglès i fins ara has tingut la sensació que la idea de l'escriptor públic en aquest aspecte d'escriptor que fa discursos en públic, de vegades amb molts espectadors, amb un sentit gairebé de fenomen estel·lar, no? De fenomen d'estrella, d'estar. No sé si tens la impressió que els últims anys la literatura anglosaxona, els grans noms, ha anat cada cop més cap aquí. És a dir, que es dediquen a donar més raó al Francis Plug, amb el que s'ensenya en aquest llibre, de l'escriptor com algú dedicat a això, a la gira.
Yes, I think even just in the time I've been writing these books, it seems to have stepped up, accelerated a gear. I remember going to the Hay Festival in England, and there's huge queues. I mean, it's like going to Glastonbury Festival. You have all these people like going to see these big star authors. So it has become, there's a lot of hype around the authors now that wasn't there before. In fact, I was speaking to a book dealer who remembers going to the Hay Festival, which is a big literary festival in Wales. He remembers going to that in the early days of the festival, and there would just be a few people after the event to talk to the authors and get their book signed, but they would have a proper conversation with the author. But these days it's like a factory line, like book, you know. In fact, I remember going somewhere and I think it was Margaret Atwood actually, and I was in the queue, and then my book got passed to 3 different people before it got to Margaret Atwood. Like someone opened it to the right page, someone put a note in or something, and then it got to Margaret Atwood, who signed it and passed it on, and then that's the next book. And so that's changed. It never used to be like that. But I mean, I found that quite interesting myself, because after the first book came out, I was involved in these author events, and I ended up, one thing, I got invited to speak at Shakespeare and Company in Paris, which is a famous bookshop, and I even stayed in the shop for a few nights as well. And that was events like that, and going to the Hay Festival as an author, which I fed back into the second book as Francis. So the experiences that I had selling the first book and being on stage and talking about it, that was Francis in the second book. He was, you know, there's one time I got that, there's Waterstones, is a big bookshop near Piccadilly Circus. It was a big chain of bookshops. But I did a Christmas event there with lots of other authors, and we were all signing books at Christmas. And in the second book, it's Francis signing books, and he ends up getting locked in the store overnight and gets into all sorts of mischief. But a lot of that was, a lot of the things that happened to me in real life, I put into the second book as things that Francis did as well.
I al mateix temps, no sé si hi ha alguna d'aquestes situacions hilarants que, per exemple, protagonitza Francis Plack en anar a demanar una assignatura, que després a tu com a autor, i diguem alguna que no surti en cap llibre, o que encara no s'hagi publicat, a tu com a autor t'ha tocat viure algunes situacions de dir, aviam, on és la càmera oculta, què està passant, qui m'ha plantat aquest personatge friqui inadaptat aquí davant. Això també passa, a la vida passen coses que semblen de ficció, no? Però...
Yeah, I mean, it's, we were talking earlier about how Francis has now taken on this life of his own. So one obvious one is that if you go to a bookshop in England, you often find this under the P section for plug, rather than the E's for my name, Ewen. And also, every year there is a Booker Prize shortlist party, where all the shortlisted authors have this party, often like at the Serpentine in Hyde Park. But my publisher received an invitation for Francis Plug, but I didn't get one. So it was an official invitation. So I went along, and there's this table with all the name tags on and there was one with Francis Plug written on it. And when I took it, the woman behind the table said, "Here's trouble." So he has kind of taken on this life of his own. And I was asked to talk at this festival in Dulwich in London, and they said to me, "What would you like to do?" Obviously, you can't get Francis to talk, but what do you want to do at the for your talk? And I said, well, maybe I could interview Francis Plug. And they said, okay. And then they did all the publicity for it, and it said, Paul Ewen interviews Francis Plug. And I still hadn't worked out how I was going to do that. So in the end, there was like a stage, and there was 2 chairs on the stage. One of the chairs had fallen over, and there was wine bottles on the stage and lots of paper everywhere. And I was sitting in the other chair, and then I think the event was supposed to start at 7 o'clock, and at 7 o'clock, there was an audience, and then about five minutes past 7, I got up and said, "I'm really sorry, but Francis hasn't arrived yet, but he should be here soon if we can just wait a little bit longer." And then I sat down, and then at 10 past 7, I started collecting all the paper off the stage, and I started looking through it, and I got up and I said, I'm so sorry he still hasn't arrived, but I think this is his speech, so why don't I start reading it, and then when he arrives he can continue reading it. So then I started reading his speech, but he was talking about Dulwich, where this event was happening, and saying all sorts of things about how terrible it was, like because that's where Margaret Thatcher used to live, and he was saying, "Oh, she's terrible," and Dulwich, and I was pretending to go, "Oh, I'm so sorry," but yeah, I was just reading his speech. So that was, it felt like, almost like surreal that I was doing an event with Francis. I guess other examples, whenever I've had a book launch, I've always read a speech from Francis, who mysteriously couldn't make it. So that has been an example of me just thinking, this is crazy. Yeah.
Però clar, està molt bé perquè primer demostra el poder de la literatura al segle XXI. Un auditori esperant a Francis Plack. I d'altra banda, em fas pensar que clar, a través de Francis Plack, donar-se el gust, per exemple, de criticar Margaret Thatcher és fantàstic també. Vull dir que és un altre poder afegit de la literatura.
It is. I mean, it's the good thing about Francis, I think, is he can say things that I would never say. He doesn't mess about with. He doesn't, we say, mince words. He's very direct, and it's also when he's talking to the authors, he will say things that I would never dream of saying to those authors either. But I think that's why he's kind of loved, because he says things that other people perhaps wouldn't say, but he's never offensive, but he just gets straight to the point, and often, hopefully, in a funny way.
Sí, diguéssim que se salta allò de la politès, que diuen en francès els prolegòmens, i de vegades és d'agrair, no? I alhora aquesta actitud a mi em feia pensar que Francis Plack va a la línia de flotació de qualsevol idea romàntica o sacralitzada de l'escriptor i de la literatura, en el fons, no? De dir, no, en literatura es pot fer de tot i un escriptor, per molt personatge públic, és algú de carn i ossos, no? És a dir, és com si tot el petit monstre entranyable que és Francis Plack, el petit monstre humorístic, treballés per desmitificar, no?
Yes, that's right. I mean, from the start, I wanted him to be an outsider. someone who wasn't an established author, wasn't in publishing, wasn't involved in the literary world at all. And I mean, that's how I felt at the time, having just arrived in London. And you know, the literary world in London is quite small, and it's a lot of people who know each other, have been to the same schools, and so it's quite a closed world in a way. So it's quite daunting if you're new to that and you're trying to break into it. I'm sure that's the same everywhere. So I wanted him to be someone who wasn't part of that crowd, who because he was on the outside of it, didn't feel he had to speak as part of it, and could comment on it as an outsider looking in, sort of, rather than someone who's, you know, already involved in it. And I think, you know, even I know people, a lot of authors, but also people in publishing, in the publishing world, like you say, they found it quite refreshing that someone was talking about their industry or the literary world in that way, which hadn't been talked about so much before. So.
Clar, és que en certa manera també, abans que anomenàvem la Margaret Thatcher, però també al capdavall em fas pensar, ara escoltant-te, no, que hi ha un classisme també en el món literari, no? Tu deies, tots es coneixen de les escoles. Jo crec que hi ha un classisme que aquest Francis Pla, que és jardiner, que només pensa en beure, també el destrossa, no? I és molt curiós, i crec que és un classisme, deixem-nos d'orgues, bastant universal, sí. No?
Yeah, that's right. He's so in the books he's a gardener, and so he will often turn up to these fancy auditoriums straight from his gardening job in his gardening clothes, and so he's I guess he's not the usual person that you'd expect to see at these events, but he's, you know, obviously writers come from all sorts of backgrounds, and he's that's where he's coming from. So what's interesting is in the second book, I became writer in residence at the University of Greenwich in London, and so the second book is called Writer in Residence, and Francis is the writer in residence at the University of Greenwich. And what was interesting with that was it was a bit of a step change, because he was now not just a gardener, he was an academic, I suppose. So his status had changed. So there was a concern, I think, from my publisher that we would lose something because he wouldn't be the same status. But I think when you get a certain personality that doesn't fit with a certain environment, it still works, and Francis definitely didn't fit with the university environment. But it was interesting because I was in that environment myself, and I was imagining every day, like, what would he do here? What would he do here? If he was in this fancy hall, what would he do? What would he do if he met this person? And one of the first things he did was find out where all the local pubs were. But I think, it was something I needed to think about with the second book, was how to maintain that status of his, where he's still an outsider and he's still like an underdog, I guess.
I entenc que amb el que estàs escrivint ara, la tercera novel·la sobre Francis Plack, no no s'ha adaptat al sistema, no, encara, suposo? Vull dir, no hem de patir.
No. So the third book, because Hilary Mantel suggested that he should be on the fourth plinth, which is this place where these artworks are exhibited. Even though she's been a bit tongue-in-cheek, he takes that advice literally. So in the third book, he thinks, yeah, she's right, I should be on the fourth plinth. So he decides to become an artist. So a lot of the books I've been getting signatures for in the last couple of years are famous artists who Francis meets in the third book. And again, yes, you're right. It's a similar challenge to the university, but because he doesn't know anything about the art world, and also the art world is even more out of reach than the literary world. I mean, it's become a place for the super rich, where the super rich meet and mix. There's just been the Frieze art festival in London this last week, and I'm on their newsletter, and when they first advertised the event, they say, oh, here's some hotels you can stay at, and it's all the most expensive hotels in London, and it's completely a different world from Francis's world. Even as a published author, he's still very much out of his depth. So it's still rich material to work with.
No, és interessant perquè parlàvem de classes, doncs aquí entenc que ja anem cap a un altre cantó i a més és fascinant la capacitat, trobo, de Francis Plack de fer amics tot arreu, no? Vull dir que el món de l'art el rebran amb els braços oberts. Però sí que volia demanar una altra cosa sobre aquesta idea de personatge inadaptat. A mi em feia pensar, és una pregunta seriosa, però em feia pensar, la literatura és el bot salvavides dels inadaptats, o potser hem de pensar que ser inadaptat al segle XXI, tal com estan les coses, és l'autèntica via de supervivència? No dic que haguem de ser Francis Plack, però potser ens l'hem de llegir com un llibre d'autoajuda. Tal vegada, eh?
Yeah, it's funny. Someone did send me a photo of this book in a self-help section of a bookshop. I think because it's a how to be a public author. I mean, I think many of the creative areas like art and music and writing, I think they very much are places, and also art schools where they encourage you to be a misfit. You know, I've been talking to various artists with this new book, and that was one of the reasons why the YBAs, the Young British Artists, suddenly came together as a movement, because they were all studying at Goldsmiths College, where the tutors at that time were really encouraging them to be themselves and to not look at it from an academic point of view, and they all really thrived under this really creative, supportive environment. I think, I mean, the great thing about writing a novel in particular is it gives you time to talk through a lot of things on your mind and feed them through and explore them where they can go, whether it's politics, you know, the state of the world. When I was when I was starting this, I was very interested in how I could become part of this literary world, or what the literary world was like at the time. So I channeled all those thoughts into the book. So I think it's a really useful way to talk about yourself. I'm using a character who does things that I would never imagine doing myself. Or I do imagine doing them, but I wouldn't be brave enough to do. So in that way, I'm taking the misfitness that I have, and using a character or a novel to get it out there. But I think you can do that in music as well, and lots of other creative ways.
Clar, l'humor anglès és una tradició, segons com, sagrada en si mateixa, no? Té una certa entitat sagrada. Tu com a escriptor, tu com a persona has fet la teva formació a Anglaterra. Llegint-te, a mi particularment em venia al cap Jonathan Coe, que no sé si és un autor que t'interessa o no, però és inevitable pensar potser en el Totem Woodhouse, com a autors anglesos que han conreat, com a autor anglès que ha conreat l'humor. No sé si que et relacionin amb l'humor anglès t'agrada, et molesta, tens la impressió que com a etiqueta pot ser neutralitzadora, és a dir, com t'hi relaciones amb la idea d'estar escrivint humorísticament i que se't pugui dir que és humor anglès com tal o tal altre?
I would hope not. I would hope it's not seen as British humour. I mean, I think some of the funniest people I know today are actually from New Zealand. Like some of the biggest, the funniest films, and the comedians who are winning at the Edinburgh Festival, they're New Zealanders. So I would, I always, I never promote myself as a British writer, and I guess there may be elements of British humour in what I write, but I would, most of the books I grew up on were not, apart from like Enid Blyton when I was younger, most of the adult books were all New Zealand writers. I mean, someone like Janet Frame is one of my favourite authors, and she is a very funny writer. She's not known as a comedy writer, but she's got a great sense of humour. But I mean, I haven't, I didn't sort of grow up on reading a lot of comedy novels, although I do appreciate Jonathan Coe books, P.G. Wodehouse, and but I mean, I read like Kerry Hume, Patricia Grace. A lot of Patricia Grace is a New Zealand author. All of Janet Frame. I really loved reading Janet Frame particularly. So yeah, it's. I'm not sure about that. There's not a lot of comedy authors in New Zealand that I am aware of, but there are a lot of comedy people, whether it's in directors or screenwriters or stand-up comedians. I think there's been a big surge since sort of the 90s onwards, maybe more, with the Flight of the Conchords, and there's more of an appreciation of New Zealand humour than there was when I was first growing up. So I'm expecting there to be a lot more comedy novelists coming out of New Zealand. I hope so.
Molt bé, doncs queda clar que reivindiquem l'humor neozelandès. D'acord. I sí que, per anar acabant, sí que volia preguntar, a partir de l'experiència de Paul Ewen, l'experiència de Francis Plack, els actes públics sobre literatura amb escriptors serveixen d'alguna cosa? A partir de l'experiència d'aquests 50 minuts, pots respondre el que creguis, pots dir, mira, em faig tard per veure un partit de rugbi. No, però és una broma.
Oh no, this talk has been great. I mean, this is a bit strange, having a large picture of myself. And also, this is the first time I've done a translated one, and it's been brilliant. Thank you. I mean, I do enjoy. It's interesting that I was literally terrified when I started doing author events, because a lot of that fed into Francis. He was worried about getting up on stage, but it's the same old story that the more you do, the better you get, and the more easier it is. So I do quite enjoy them now, particularly when it's something more interesting like this one. But yeah, I'm doing another talk on the later this month, and they asked for a ghost story, so I'm like, that'll be interesting. But yeah, I mean, I do prefer the writing side of books, but I think I'm not surprised that so many authors sort of jump at the chance to do events, because if you're sitting in the same room for 6 months or 2 years, it's nice to go out and meet people, and obviously I've been so honoured to be asked to
beure una copa de vi.
Yeah, to come to. Oh yeah, that is true. But yeah, I've been so honoured to come to Barcelona to talk about my books as well, and that's an amazing experience to have as an author, and so I'm very grateful to be able to do that as well. So.
Clar, per acabar, un últim comentari. Fa poc vaig participar en una trobada d'escriptors a Astúries, un lloc dins l'estat espanyol, on teníem uns debats tancats, és a dir, no oberts al públic. Era una cosa com bastant curiosa, són els encuentros de verines, en diuen, que és el lloc on es fan. Ara, en llegir-te i havent tornat d'aquesta trobada amb escriptors amb uns debats tancats, pensava que potser les presentacions o xerrades de llibres haurien de ser també tancades, és a dir, com un acte secret del qual hem d'investigar què s'ha dit. Potser aleshores guanyaríem, com un joc de pistes, guanyaríem lectors i interès per la literatura. No sé si el Francis Plack ho veuria bé, això.
I think he'd be right up for that. Yeah, I think, that it is, I do wonder sometimes when I was going to like these big Booker Prize winners, how many people had actually read the books. And sometimes they would give away spoilers about the books. So if you hadn't read it, you would miss out. But I think there's definitely something to be said for that, to encourage people to not just read the books, but to find out more what the authors are saying without just being a bookshop signing thing. If they're actually given the opportunity to learn more in a more focused way, I think it's a good thing. I'm not sure what Francis would be happy about it, I think. Yeah.
Sí, evidentment en aquesta trobada que dic, després els debats es pengen escrits en algun lloc, però és curiós perquè, i pensava també en aquesta idea de l'escriptor públic, Francis Plack li fa un seguit de recomanacions de com comportar-se en públic, no? I per tant és com una nova ficció que s'aixeca. No sé si, ja per acabar, si abans de passar a les preguntes del públic, si hi ha algun consell d'en Francis Plack que hagis dit, ostres, em sembla que amb això té raó, m'ho aplicaré en els actes públics. Consell, reflexió...
Oh, wow. I think a lot of things he just, even if they're not words of advice, just things he picks up on, things he says, I do think often are quite thoughtful and make a lot of sense. Trying to think of something offhand. I can't think of it. I mean, it's not so much advice, but just observations, I think. He has a lot of interesting observations about certain things like literary festivals and publishers particularly. I think there's one advice he talks about how the big publishers these days, and this is an issue in real life, that the small independent publishers are the bravest publishers, and they tend to take the risks, the financial risks on an up-and-coming authors that are unknown, and then the big publishers, when they know it's a safer option, they come in. And I'm with an independent publisher, and I think I was the second book they published, but the first book was a book by Emma McBride, A Girl is a Half-Formed Thing, and it won a couple of really big prizes, but then Faber and Faber jumped down and stole her. So that's something that I think Francis talks about in here, is that the publishers with the big pockets take the least risks and leave it all to the publishers who have no money and take it all on their shoulders. So I think that's one observation that Francis has made that I think makes a lot of sense. So it's not all drunken ramblings.
No, molt clarament. Molt clarament, sí. És a dir, té grans moments de lucidesa, diguem-ne, en Francis Plack. Molt bé, escolta, si et sembla, obrim preguntes del públic, si algú té ganes de preguntar-li a en Powell, Ewen, Francis Plack alguna qüestió. Podeu preguntar el que pensa ell, el que creu que pensaria Francis Plack, vosaltres mateixos.
Merci. D'acord, doncs la meva pregunta, relacionat amb el que acabes de dir, és... O sigui, tu has parlat del consell que Paul s'hauria d'aplicar de Francis Plack, però tu, Paul, si li poguessis donar un consell o un missatge a Francis Plack, què li diries? Moltes gràcies.
Well, I guess I would say keep being yourself. I mean, in every kind of adventure he's had, he's started off with these Booker Prize winning author events. He's then moved into the university life. He's travelled to these festivals, he's travelled to Paris, and but he's always stayed true to what he is, even when he published his first book and became quite well known, he didn't change. So I would advise him to stay true to himself, and I think that's also good advice for writers, for young writers. Like, don't write to the market. Write what you want to write, and the market will catch up. So when J.K. Rowling wrote Harry Potter, she didn't jump on a boy wizard bandwagon. She wrote it because she wanted to, and then next thing you know, everyone's writing wizard books. But she started it because it was what she wanted to write. So I think that's good advice, which I would give Francis also. Thanks.
Molt bé, alguna altra qüestió? Pregunta, comentari?
Thank you. Thanks for the interesting talk. I noticed you have a few bookmarks in your book, and I wondered if you had some passages that you liked most about the book.
Yeah, one of them was for the Kerry Hume chapter, and I think what's interesting about that is she's the most, as I mentioned, she's the most like Francis. You know, that's what he aspires to be like, Kerry Hume. It's a wonderful novel, by the way. If you haven't read Kerry Hume's The Bone People, it's a breathtaking book. But she lives like she died sadly a few years ago, but she lived in a house that she built herself next to the beach, and she used to catch fish and write and go to the pub down the road. So she was pretty much the perfect author in Francis's mind. The other passage was actually the very final chapter, just to remind me, which was Eleanor's book. At the final, without hopefully giving away too much of a spoiler, Eleanor was the last Booker Prize winner that Francis went to see, and I wasn't allowed into the Booker Prize ceremony when she won because I didn't have a ticket, but I did go into the it's the Guildhall was the venue in London, which is very, very fancy venue, and I did go in on another day. Just I kind of slipped in, and I was taking lots of notes so I could see what Francis would do. Bit of a spoiler: he climbs up one of the walls, but and then I was asked to leave because I think they thought I was up to no good taking notes in there. But yeah, that was the final chapter, and I was actually hanging around outside the Guildhall that night, just because I wanted a sense of the people that when they came out, and I was watching them go in and all dressed up, and then I found out online outside that she had won, and I was so happy, like for New Zealand, yeah. But for Eleanor, yeah, it was a great night. So that's how the book finishes with Eleanor. Yeah. in a happy way.
Clar, jo no em puc creure que el Booker Prize finalment no t'enviï invitacions anuals per entrar-hi. No hi deu haver un llibre que l'homenatgi millor al Booker Prize.
Yeah, there was a when they had the 40-year anniversary of the Booker Prize, they did invite me to do a podcast recording talking about Francis and all the Booker Prize events I'd been to. But I think also like I think there's over 30 Booker Prize winners in here, and I've attended all those events in real life, and I took loads of notes. So if anyone ever wants to write about the Booker Prize in a serious way, I have lots of material about the authors, and sadly, even the authors in this book, quite a few have died. So I've got all this, I took details about what they were wearing and how they spoke, how they sat in the chair, and what they were doing, everything. So, because these are all things that Francis is taking note of, because okay, I must have my leg crossed that way and all this. So I've got all these notes from all these many events as well. Yeah.
Molt bé, doncs si no hi ha cap més pregunta, si et sembla bé, com a acte públic el podríem tancar aquí. Autor, tens l'última paraula.
Okay, yes, thank you so much.
Gràcies.
Gracias.